Morning, everyone, and thanks for getting up early and making time for this important conversation. We have some great panelists that Will has reached out to who have agreed to participate in this discussion today. Before COVID hit, for the last, 6 or so years of my working in downtown, it was interrupted by 2.5 years out of town in Detroit, but for the rest of those years, I've been taking the GO line from Pasadena down to Union Station, jumping on the red or purple, going 3 stops and walking 2 blocks to an office. Life was good. Now we're in a different situation. And so it's timely that we would have this conversation today about transit mobility, sort of present, and then what will be provocative is future. How will we emerge from this pandemic in ways that either strengthen and reinforce our old habits as humans of interacting in close quarters, or will there in fact be a reset on how we interact and how we experience public space? So with that, we've got, I'm sorry, I'm a little discombobulated because I was the source of that technical difficulty this morning. The link kept taking me to a July 2nd meeting. And finally, I scrolled down further and it was the same address, but Will, you were right, persistence. So we have, Tamika Butler, she has joined, okay, with Tool Design. Neil Brooker, who's the CEO of BMW Group Design Works. Keandra, I'll skip the middles, Dodds, who is deals with equity and race at Metro. So I've got a few questions for you. And Jordan Goldstein, who is familiar to some of my colleagues with Gensler, FAIA, Global Director of Design. And then we have Moshik Maan, who's an architect whose work has demonstrated a certain sensitivity to his clients, the users, and from my own sort of looking into it, someone who is in a position of influence as policy and best practice starts to emerge. And lastly, Nicholas Demanchou, I get that right?
Yeah.
Good enough. Who's a professor and incoming head of architecture at MIT. So quite a nice spectrum. And I'm going to start this off with a question, and some of these questions may relate more to the individual panelists, but we're really inviting a robust conversation in the time we have today. So as I lay out these questions, I'll suggest who might initiate an answer, but then I'd like for the other panelists to just weigh in. And in the interest of time and trying to cover as much of this material as we can, I would simply ask that we be as edited as possible in these responses. Will, is there time for Q&A at the end? Do the participants chat in messages? How does that work?
Yes, everyone is invited to use the raise the hand feature. It's under the participant section, or you can type your question into the chat and we'll get to questions in about 40 minutes or so.
All right, good. So let's get this thing started. I do want to start with Metro, with Keandra. So a big picture question. How has COVID-19 impacted ridership on both buses and trains? And I guess how's Metro looking at this in the midterm, long term?
So, hi everyone, I'm Keandra Kyler Dodds. That's my last name, Kyler Dodds. So thanks for having me. One, just happy to join this conversation. I'll start by saying, like most transit agencies, Metro has been significantly impacted as far as our ridership by COVID-19. Our average daily trips were about, on average, 1.2 million per weekday. And since COVID, I want to say early April, that dropped as low as just below 300,000 per day. We're back up to about 500,000 per day. And we've been doing a lot of work to figure out, what happened And what is the source of that decrease in ridership? We have some surveys, some early survey data that tells us that a good majority is related to jobs. A significant number of people have either lost jobs or been furloughed or have started telecommuting or are working part-time now. And so it's important for us as we think about planning towards the future to understand how people have been impacted, because I think in the short term, given that we don't really know when this will all be over, it's important to consider the factors that are ongoing. And I think in the long term, it's important to think about what those factors might mean for the future. So will those folks who are telecommuting now, will they be telecommuting forever? That's a significant change to our system. Or, and those people that lost their jobs, we hope they get their jobs back, and then that brings the mark as the economy grows, and that increases our ridership. But it's a little bit of a guessing game, trying to figure out what is to come of the future. But it's been helpful to understand through the surveys that we've been able to do what's been the main source of the loss of that ridership. And the last thing I'll say is that we've seen a higher decrease in rail than we have with buses. And as it increases again, that rail is slower to increase again.
Great, great. Well, to build on that, and I want to draw the design minds into this, or the architect design minds first. So to Jordan, to Moshik, how are these scenarios of impacting your current work as you look at the public realm, as you look at transit-oriented development, some of which many of our firms were sort of thriving on with clients? Can you speak to the impacts maybe from your client's standpoint or from just your internal vision of how you want to carry out this work moving into the near future? Some projects were underway in the middle of design, and there are consequences, right?
Sure, it's Jordan, and thank you for having me on. It's great to see all of you. I know this is early LA time. I'm in Washington, DC, so middle of the day here. But I think that one of the things I would say is that we're seeing definitely, I would say a migration to a new normal, where, a lot of short-term innovations become long-term transformations, and coping mechanisms that people are doing now to get through these challenging times starting to become new norms. We did a work from home survey to over 2,300 people around the country outside of our firm. And it was interesting, only 12% of those surveyed wanted to work from home full time. So there was this desire and this need expressed through this research that we did that, close to 70% want to return to work for a good balance of their time. And surprisingly to me, the younger generations, the millennial generations, were feeling less productive at home and wanted to be back in the office. And the common denominator of all that we researched was that what were they missing from the workplace? And that was the idea of interaction, of that ideas of those collisions and the benefits of the meeting people up in the hallway and being able to have spontaneous conversations, the idea of in-person collaborations, and certainly even in a return to work scenario, in the short term, we're going to see hybrid versions of that. So I think a couple of things, we've realized. One is people that are expecting to come back to work are also expecting that they're going to come back to a different type of work environment. And that I think that also gives us a kind of a charge to think differently about the public realm, about that built environment in the urban core. I'll just hit on a couple of quick things that I think we're seeing is that, we're seeing this here in DC. I know this is happening in LA, is that streets are being reclaimed for people. They're being shut down. And, there was a lot of pre-pandemic research on this, and, we were part of it. Others were part of it. Probably many on this call were part of it, about that evolution of mobility and taking back portions of our streets and rethinking that relationship of that edge, the edge of building to sidewalk to street. And then now with this pandemic, social distancing and the needs for outdoor dining and survival of retail and food and beverage, that the streets are becoming spaces that can actually be wonderful ways to bring people together. And
that really brings up interrupt you here because I want to bring Tamika and Mo into this conversation. Sure. From their perspectives, but it's interesting that you took it there, Jordan, because I was about to build on the previous question with this notion of, as fewer cars have been on the road, as people ranging from people like me in a neighborhood up above Pasadena who rediscovered my community by walking a couple of miles every day for 3-4 months now. That begs the notion of it's nice to take a street that had been normally a busy street and walk right down the middle of it, right down the center dashed yellow line. And so in your work, Tamika and Mo, both, how do you see the sort of ceding of the right-of-way territory from vehicles to pedestrians, or is that something that you feel is got a limited potential?
I guess I'll start. One of the things that's I think particularly fascinating about being an architect focused in infrastructure, what I call social infrastructure, through the expression of transportation, is operating in an environment like Southern California, where the prevailing model for the urban context and suburban context has been driven by the personal occupancy vehicle and the suburban home. It's been sort of a model of economic sort of prosperity, which has been fairly exclusive, but nonetheless sort of predicated on an idea of disparity and sort of this sort of thin and low dense sort of context operate in. How do you take 60 years of development and introduce different modes of accessing what we would call the new American dream, whether it's property ownership, et cetera. And I think infrastructure, because it really allows an alternative to the personal occupancy vehicle and the idea of living in a downtown where you have higher densities, you then begin to sort of contrive new models of living prosperously. So when you're living in more compact environments where you don't have the benefit of a suburban home, where you have your own front yard, backyard, pool, recreation built in and all that, where do you discover that kind of amenity if you're living in a vertical condition? And clearly, streets have to be reimagined as a new form of front yard and social space, a sort of an expression of the patio. So absolutely, I think that the trend of transit investment that we've been seeing in the last, 10, 15 years in Southern California is driving us to reimagine sort of this suburban context, this personal occupancy vehicle context, to now become personal experience, individual experience context, the social condition that we would want. But we are confronted by this contradiction today, which is where you have, vibrant urban conditions that are predicated on the idea of intense socializing, and you have this virus which actually propagates itself around sort of innate human behaviors to socialize. It's almost the ideal nemesis. It counters sort of the very principle of planning this way. How do we overcome that, in the short term and the long term? That's really the question. I'm betting that, well,
sorry.
no, just very quickly. I'm betting that, we will eventually have a vaccine. There's questions whether herd immunity is actually even feasible with people getting reinfected. But, in time, I imagine that we're going to sort of rediscover the vibrancy of cities and sort of relearn to trust our transit system. But I think one thing that we are challenged with as a culture is the idea of adapting behaviors, which, like simply wearing a mask, for example, that sort of causes us and challenges us to overcome those sort of, abilities to adapt new behaviors that mean that we could still thrive in an urban condition without subjecting ourselves to the vulnerability of a pandemic. So hopefully we can develop new protocols and methods of communication and coordinating that sort of allows us to sort of, be more successful in that condition. But definitely streets and also natural networks like the LA River will become new sort of modes of public space.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Tamika, before I drag you into that question from yours and tool standpoint, I will say that along with the colleague Jerome Uchenreiner in our ZGF Seattle office, we just co-authored a piece on reclaiming streets. And I wrote the opening part of the article, and the first line is the existential question surrounding the axiom, if you build it, they will come, as in this new street infrastructure. The existential question is, who are they? There is a sense of, particularly for people in low-income neighborhoods, communities, and this would hold true within the urban fabric as well, a sense that any improvement, any move forward is seeding the ground for gentrification and ultimately displacement. So there's how do you bridge, and I'll lay this one out to you, Tamika, beyond what you were going to say just about the pure physics of converting streets to public amenity space. How do you bridge the equity divide as it relates to mostly people's perception of who things are for?
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. And like everyone said, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting us, Will. This is a great panel. I'll also just say that I no longer work at Tool Design, so I can't speak for Tool Design. I now have my own consulting practice, Tamika L. Butler Consulting, but still doing a lot of the same work and still partnering with Tool a bunch. And part of the reason I went to Tool is because it was always a design and planning firm focused on active transportation, walking and biking. And so I would say that, a lot of these things that seem new to some people have been happening for a long time. They've just been fought back against, happening and suggested by people who understand the implications of climate and equity and income and economic mobility being tied to transportation mobility. And so a lot of this, we're talking about as a new kind of normal, but it's without an acknowledgement of to what you said, Stephen, who's that normal we're focusing on, and what does that look like? And so I think when we think about things like reimagining streets, whether it's through some of these slow streets programs or dining on the sidewalk, my question is always, who are these things for, right? And cities like LA, where it's been ridiculously hard for advocates and for people who street vend to be able to be on the sidewalk and make a living, and then all of a sudden it is wildly easy and the red tape is cut for restaurants to be able to do the same thing because they are valued more. And so I think when we look at infrastructure and we look at transportation and when we look at these programs, to do it successfully, you have to look at it outside of just the silo of transportation or infrastructure. You have to look at these intersectional issues. And I think for some people, it has felt like, oh my gosh, this is so overwhelming. We have a pandemic going on, and then we have an eruption of racial injustice. And how do you balance both? And how do you watch the news? And how do you think about this in your work? And for those of us who are people of color, particularly Black people, that's how work has always been. It's just we've been in the meeting saying, well, you have to think about when you open the street, if they build it, will they come? Who will be policed if they come? Who are we designing benches for to not have them stay too long? Who doesn't feel like they can go out on a jog or just sit in the park? And when you privatize sidewalks for businesses, who is kept from those businesses? And in many places, streets are our largest resource. I used to run a nonprofit that built parks and gardens in low-income communities. And it was hard to find those spots for parks and gardens. And so we were using open lots and streets, right? And so when you create these programs that are supposed to benefit everyone, but you still fail to be able to have a rich discussion about anti-racism or white supremacy or policing, things that seem far afoot from our particular chosen fields, then you're not really doing service to the folks who you say you hope to serve. The folks who can't leave the city and get to their, cabin by the beach are at the lake. And so I think those are the kinds of questions we constantly have to be asking ourselves. What are the powers and who has control, and what are the privileges that are maybe unsaid, that's really hard for folks?
Yeah, that it's $1 million response to that question. We have to talk. But all of what we're discussing right now has to do with streets and infrastructure. And Neil, what happens if the streets go away? What happens to your job? Neil's with
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm the car guy, I guess, in the mix of some great architects here. So first of all, thank you for hosting me. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and it's actually part of what Jordan and I are working on. We'll talk a little bit about that later, where we're starting to think about a new tomorrow, where, if you start to work as architects and as automotive people and start to think together to solve the solutions, maybe there's a better solution out there. So you start to think about, let's start to blur the boundaries that we currently have. There's very much a standoff between the cars or mobility on the roads towards the buildings. What if this is more integrated? What if we work together to find those solutions? If you look at the bigger BMW picture, BMW is committed to having about 50% of its sales as electric by 2030. There's a current challenges in the automotive industry that we call ACEs. It's autonomous, connected, electric, and service or shared. Most of the car companies were addressing these things before the COVID, but what I think you're seeing now is car companies starting to focus on specific areas that they can affect. So electric is one of those that we can affect. So a commitment to sustainability, a commitment to sustainable and clean energy. So really, if I now take that and say, what am I doing in that particular field? I work with BMW Design Works. We are part of BMW Design, but our job is also to work with other companies and to try to find solutions. So we're working also in aviation, we're working in mass transit, we're working in electric mopeds, everything basically around mobility. And the job is for us to come back and rattle the cage in Munich and tell them, hey guys, we're in Los Angeles, we're in Shanghai. This is what we're seeing. This is where the opportunity is. This is where BMW can contribute. And to that point, this is where BMW wants to go. Cars are typically seen as the nemesis of what we're all trying to achieve here. BMW wants to be a solution provider. It wants to be part of the solution. So we're trying to engage as both BMW and DesignWorks in some of these bigger conversations to see if there's a better way of doing this. And then more specifically, and Jordan can comment on this later, we've engaged in a project with Gensler, DesignWorks and Gensler, where we're starting to say, if we work together, is there a new vision, a 2030 vision that we can paint for these cities that's more incorporative, where we start to blur the boundaries, where we start to think about if electric charging systems are everywhere and there's electricity for everyone, can that help other people? Maybe, if the cars are charging during the day off of a system, can other people who don't have the privilege to that electricity get access to that electricity because it's now going to be on the street for them? So we're looking at these different solutions, see what other ways we can imagine the future in this sort of 2030 time horizon.
Interesting. I want to move to Nicholas because if there's a crystal ball among us, I would say the MIT crystal ball might be the most revealing in terms of a direction and the challenges and how you're meeting that moment. Nicholas, what's the scuttlebutt up in Cambridge?
Well, I've been in Cambridge for 6 rather intense weeks. So I took this job on June 1st. And I think, to the extent that I actually have any scuttlebutt, it probably comes from my previous tenure. As you can tell from my slightly messed up accent, I've lived in a lot of different places, but the longest I've lived anywhere was actually in Berkeley and Oakland for 15 years up until last year. And I ran until last year an organization called the Berkeley Center for New Media. And I guess if there's a thread, something I would want to highlight, it would be to connect two parts of this discussion and the discussions that led to me as an architect becoming head of BCNM, which is that we're talking still so far in this conversation as if the physical spaces and the space of virtual work that we're on now, and with all of its joys in the Zoom conversation, are two separate things, and they're not. The real world of work and life and the work of the landscape of the city are inextricably and inescapably intertwined at this point, and so we're going to continue to see that hybridization transform, but it's not an either or. But then I would also highlight in the context of what Tamika was saying, that we call it structural racism and inequity because it's built into structures, sometimes physical structures of the city, and sometimes now increasingly virtual structures of how we relate to each other online. And in each of those, and also especially move between the two. And so something that I've certainly been thinking a lot about at BCNM and led to my desire to come to MIT, which I would be the first to say is an environment that needs a lot of work itself in terms of its institutional culture, is that the space of technology and the space of the city are one space, and these issues are present in both, and these issues cross over between them. And to make one last point about this, I think, as an architect, I think a lot about the physical space of the city and how much these issues make themselves present literally physically, and public transportation, the topic of and mobility, the topic of our panel today, are crucial to that, because one of the things that the serendipity of cities and institutions rely on is mobility and the ability of people to bump into opportunity, literally speaking. But that it's also very important, as a kind of last point to make, is that equality of access, which is what we're trying to go for when we design streets and public spaces, and equity are two different things. One doesn't guarantee the other. One is an important step to the other. You literally can't get out of the door. If you literally can't get out of the door, you can't get out of the door of a conversation around equity, but it's not enough. So if every space is identical, it may be equal, but it's not equitable, because different people are going to feel different degrees of comfort and welcome in those spaces and flowing through them. So what we want to go for is that equality of access to opportunity, which doesn't always necessarily look like things literally being equal either. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Right. Well, that sort of peels back some layers of complexity around the issue of who uses transit, who used transit 3 or 4 months ago and who uses transit today. And Kendra was saying, from over 1 million riders down to 300,000 at the low point, but now back up to 500. You have to wonder, if you were to do a demographic deep dive into that ridership, who is using mass transit right now? I'm sure that for most, if not all, it's not because it's their preferred way of getting from point A to point B. But as we look, and it's just, so let's roll back a little historically. After World War II, GI Bill, white folks allowed to buy homes, black folks not. The suburbs propagated to service the need of suburban people needing to get into the downtown. The Federal Highways Act came along, and in many of our cities, the highway, the freeway just erased the Black community in particular. And now we've been in this trend back to urbanism, and I forget the exact percentages, but by the year 2050, for how many percent of the world's population will be living in urban centers. And while low-income workers in those urban centers are in pretty stressful conditions right now, and have been, the wealthier part of our population has been reimagining life in the city. Parents whose children have now matriculated through school, who are getting jobs and getting their loft or micro unit in the downtown of cities. Parents are thinking, we no longer need the 3 or 4 bedroom, 5,000 square foot house in the suburbs, and we want to be near our child or children. So we're going to buy a flat down in the downtown. and enjoy that robust living lifestyle that is obviously connected to the physical interaction piece. So now here we go. Are people going to, is there going to be a second wave of flight? Not white flight this time, but economic green flight, people with money trying to carve out that space in the someone mentioned don't have the resources to have a house up on the lake or whatever to get away to. How are you all meeting this challenge of social inequality, structural inequality within our systems, our transportation systems, and every other system? How do we use this opportunity today, regardless of how we wind up with a vaccine, without a vaccine, however? How do we take this moment and try to level the playing field, as it were, in terms of public safety, health, safety, welfare of the public, and special attention to those most vulnerable by their circumstances as it relates to transit? Kendra, and on your doorstep.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. At Metro, I think we're doing that in a couple different ways. So I'm new to Metro. I just joined in January, but my role is the executive officer of equity and race. So my job is to lead us as we more intentionally address equity through our work. And during this time, given the COVID crisis, all of the civil unrest, et cetera, we have a recovery task force that is exploring that very question about the future, and really trying to be more intentional than we've ever been on trying to make sure that we're doing it and thinking about it in a more equitable way, asking those various questions about who really will benefit from this and what are the burdens, and is that benefit shared regardless of ability? What may be some of those barriers? Our equity platform, and I appreciate Nicholas's comments, because our equity platform, it focuses on improving access to opportunity, but recognizing that there are barriers that prevent people from equally accessing those opportunities. And so our goal is to understand those disparities, try and understand the root causes of those, and then make decisions, investments, et cetera, that help to remove those barriers. That's the ultimate goal. And so we're working really hard to have those conversations and try to change the way that we think about these decisions, these investments, this type of planning, et cetera. The other thing that I'll say is we're also focused on our core ridership. We know that even before the pandemic, the majority of our riders were by far communities of color and low-income communities. I think over 70% of communities of color, and the majority, their average income were less than $25,000 per day. Those percentages have only increased during this COVID crisis. We have at least 2 different surveys that indicate that there are a higher percentage of the core ridership that is still riding our system now. And one interesting difference is there's a higher percentage of non-English speaking riders as well. So we are focused on those who are truly using our system as a lifeline to make sure that we're making it, making sure that it's more safe for them, and trying to understand what does that mean. There's safety as far as the public health crisis and considering questions around, can you social distance in a train? What does that look like? What does that mean? How do we, can we provide more masks? We have a program where we're providing free masks. We're giving them out, and we're trying to figure out where are the key locations to be able to provide masks to those who are most in need and may have little access to masks, or simply have higher rates of COVID as well. So we're considering those different factors as far as high need. We're also trying to, we're looking very closely just to figure out what those disparities are. It's been interesting to look at who our riders are on our buses and trains versus things like our bike share. The bike share, the average income for bike share is about $50,000. So it's a bit more than our ridership on buses or trains, which is interesting as we think about who's using the different parts of our system. So we're trying to be very strategic about focusing on those core riders, trying to understand what the experience is like of riding our system and how we can improve it for them as we look to move forward. Because one thing that's really critical to our equity work is recognizing that opportunity trickles up, it doesn't trickle down. And so if we focus on those who are faring the worst and try to remove those barriers and address their needs as we move forward, hopefully we can start to really create a more equitable system and try and address some of those systemic inequities that are experienced through our system and through our land use in the built environment.
Yeah, great. I want to just go back a second to the statement I made leading up to that question, which was the characterization of the move of baby boomers back into the downtown to be proximate to their kids and to enjoy that lifestyle. And one of our participants privately chatted me that demographic information that he's familiar with shows a trend of millennials who are trying to start families actually moving back out to the suburbs. That brings up even a much more different sort of interesting challenge. When suburbs came into being and highways were built and there was white flight, what was left behind in the inner city, right? Poverty, hopelessness, and despair, the likes of which we're still reckoning with today. Are we potentially looking at another round of that pattern where people with means are exploiting the downtowns of our cities for their own use and fleeing back to a bastion of safety? That's provocative. Jordan.
Yeah, I guess two thoughts on that. I think your point a second ago was about the stats. I think we see that too, and I think on the suburbia question, it's interesting. Pre-pandemic, it was almost like suburbia in so many of our major metropolitan areas were becoming urban fringes, right? The cities were expanding and the suburban edges were being woven into the city fabric. We've certainly seen that in so many areas, especially in areas where mass transit was extended. Like, I'll use DC as an example. Mass transit was extended out into the Virginia suburbs, and all of a sudden, those suburbs that were shopping mall communities or bedroom communities were pre-pandemic becoming, certainly mix of living conditions and a work-life play, balance. I think there's just going to be this. I feel like we're at a point of inflection right now, where there's this. Not sure exactly which way suburbia will go, right? Like, it seems like we're seeing scenarios that are, because of the comment mentioned earlier, certainly about development being stalled out in many cases, waiting to see what's going to happen with post-pandemic realities. The other thing I think that we're seeing, and I think many on this call are probably experiencing this, I actually think it's a really healthy conversation, is in the urban cores, when there is this vacating of premises, how can those premises be reused? And can the question be, for development, does it have to be build new? And can we reuse in ways that are, different than we may have interpreted before? And I think that's going to be potentially on the table as I think a provocative conversation post-pandemic, because the costs will play out very differently to do a reuse scenario versus a build new in so many markets around the U.S. for sure. And how can those reuse, by the way, become catalysts for vibrancy and inclusiveness in neighborhoods and communities?
Yeah, I'm going to throw it to Nicholas and then over to Mo.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
No, I just wanted to say very quickly, this is, we talked about the relationship between mobility and economics in the context of equity and opportunity, but there's mobility and economics are inextricable in the context of the life and history of cities as a whole. And in some sense, suburbanization is historically was an attempt to do what happens a lot in our society, which is to sort of privatize gain and socialize losses. So the city and the rich landscape of encounter that the cities bring always drive economic growth in cities. But then when you get to leave it in the evening, you don't invest in it, and the taxes of those So I'd say the cities will always be the center of innovation, but we have to figure out how to draw in all the senses of the obligations that the benefit of that innovation gives to the landscape of the city that supplies it. I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Steve, could I add one point
Yes,
related
please.
to planning and equity? I completely agree. Your question was, are we going to experience people moving back to the suburbs, with the millennials in particular? There is a high degree of economic incentive to do so. When you look at individuals in the U.S., the whole idea of the American dream, wealth is predicated by and large by property ownership and equity. Oftentimes that property is transferred across multiple generations. So therefore, there is a built-in incentive within families to attract their, the next generation back as that wealth is transferred, even though the empty nesters may choose to relocate to a different environment where they can't continue to maintain that asset. So when you look at Southern California and you look at the, hundreds of billions of dollars of equity invested into, just hundreds of square miles of suburban homes, that is an extremely incredible incentive to go back and get access to that wealth as it's being transferred. So that systemic inequity that's sort of been pervasive for generations is expressed through that financial exchange. So absolutely, there will be a transfer back because it needs to happen. But simultaneously, this new e-commerce, which is causing major sort of decline in retail centers, like traditional areas of commerce that were dependent on vehicle access, will allow us to actually readapt these properties in such a way that maybe there's new models for community development, housing, retail, et cetera.
Interesting. Neil, you're not among the architects, but you're in this space where BMW's clientele is generally not people who work in restaurants in downtown and have to take the bus or the train to get there, right? So given the revelations that have come forth since the George Floyd incident and the subsequent surfacing of so many cell phone videos showing similar abuses, I've characterized this situation to a number of groups that I've spoken to as two parallel universes. Once you achieve self-awareness as a Black person, whether you're 2 years old or 5 or 10, you immediately understand that there are these two universes. They're in parallel. And Black folks, to survive, have had to learn how to swim seamlessly between those two universes. And when George Floyd was murdered, well, I would say that most white folks are not aware of multi-universe. There's just one and it's the default one and so forth. But when the George Floyd murder happened, say a giant wormhole opened up between those two universes and all the white folks got sucked into the Black universe and saw things that they could never unsee. And now we're dealing with a single universe that we're all looking at. Given the demographic of the BMW customer, shall we say, how much of that plays into your strategies as a designer, as DesignWorks thinking forward? And on the other hand, is the company, are you all addressing issues of social inequality and inequity in terms of strategies that will break down barriers and allow people access to whatever that future of transportation is that you guys are envisioning?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. First of all, obviously we're not discriminating at all across. We sell to everyone, to be clear. But maybe to put a bit of color on that, and I'll reference something that I've seen us using even actually before COVID. I can only really talk to the mobility situation here. There was a research study that's been referenced a lot from the University of Karlsruhe, where they say that if you look at the people who are owning vehicles, there's about 33% actually want to own a vehicle and do own a vehicle, need to own a vehicle, put it want and need. But there's an equal number that don't want to own a vehicle and don't need to own a vehicle. So it begs the question a little bit that we're starting to think about is, okay, are there different road pricing systems where those people who really want to own the vehicle? So you start to say, can we provide a better solution there?
I think we're having some issues with your signal, Neil. You went away. I hope I'm not alone in seeing that.
Yeah, no. So just to recap very, very quickly, we're looking at, by trying to engage with the cities to find a solution, we're saying, and you look towards the BMW customer, and without necessarily saying a specific demographic, but we say these are customers that enjoy driving cars. Would they be willing to pay an ongoing road payment system that would partially offset? Not sure if you can still hear me or not.
You're coming in and out. Let's come back to you if we could. I want Kendra to give you a shout. I sense that there was something that you wanted to add to that last issue, but feel free.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add, I think, it's really important when we think about this question of will people shift out to the suburbs, just to talk about housing in general. I think that plays such a huge role in the COVID crisis. Obviously, people are impacted economically, and then that impacts their ability to pay their rent or their mortgage. I mean, LA County is by far a majority renters. Even if you think about the millennial population, they're a large renter group. They suffer from high student debt. They have less wealth than their parents or older generations, and they're buying housing at lower rates in general. So I think while I'm not completely convinced that we'll have this shift, but I do think the housing market hasn't changed like we thought it might during this crisis. We've seen rents go slightly down, but the cost of housing has largely stayed the same. And so some of the things that I'm concerned about and wonder how they may impact our environment is, once the restrictions on eviction are lifted, what may happen as far as people losing their homes, how might homelessness increase, what that is going to do to the built environment and to the people of this county, and how we're going to be able to respond and adjust. I mean, we're already in the midst of an unprecedented homeless crisis, and we are struggling. And so, that's one of the concerns that I do have, and I think that will certainly impact our transit system, our mobility needs as people are forced to move perhaps into more overcrowded conditions. And even thinking about the overcrowded nature of housing within our county, that's what, if you look at the trend between overcrowding in certain neighborhoods and the higher rates of COVID, there's a big parallel there. So I think just the conversation about housing is really important when we think about this question. And so just wanted to add that.
Yeah, appreciate that. I'm getting a stream of messages from our wonderful attendees today, and got a nice little exclamation from one saying, "Design for dignity, man." And, as architects, we're being forced. I mean, it's always been in my DNA. I'm second generation. My dad was an architect. He started a firm in 1970, 3 black guys in a partnership. Who knew that all those years later, I'd be one of 3 black guys in a partnership at Raw, which we started in '84. And, looking out for being conscious of as a byproduct of identity and understanding, and being sort of immersed willfully and joyfully in that culture. Our work has always included the equity lens in it. And now everybody's being asked to clip on that lens. And so organizational change is afoot right now. And the question is, will it be frustrated by lack of progress and then a gradual return to the old state? Or have we reached a tipping point where designing for dignity, designing for equity and equality are now the essential elements of programming when we're looking at projects. And if that is to whatever degree true in your various organizations or practices, how does that start to influence ideas, thoughts about how to create transit infrastructure or modify transit infrastructure in a way that, and this is kind of multi-layered question, in a way that promotes the psychological elements of a new day for diversity, equity, and inclusion, most recently morphed further to be the acronym JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion. How do our firms or our organizations, and then how do we as individuals become champions to not let that flame be extinguished? I'll throw it wide open to whoever wants to jump on that.
I mean, I can start, and I would just say that part of why I've been quiet in this conversation is because it's felt really intellectual, and it hasn't seemed as much about people. And I think that's an essential part of making change. There are these structures that have to be changed. There are these systems and these policies that have to be changed. But the people who enforce those systems, who make up those systems, who make up those policies, they are people. And so as people, we have to figure out how we're going to do some of this work. And I think there are many of us who are hopeful that this is an inflection point and that there is a change. But to your earlier comment about there being these parallel universes, I like the imagery of it. And then there was, this black hole that opened and sucked white people in. I think in addition to hope and feeling like things might finally change, there is also anger, because all of the white people who were sucked into this hole made conscious decisions to ignore it before, right? And people could argue like, I just didn't know, I didn't make a conscious decision. Google is a thing. The whole internet is there. And these videos did not start with George Floyd, and they will, unfortunately, as we have already seen, not end with George Floyd. And I think there's also this piece around people having this awakening, but the awakening is still predicated on those in power deciding they want to have it, right? Because it was never good enough to just listen to people of color. So when people say things like, well, I didn't know racism was a thing, or I didn't know this kind of stuff was still happening, it's because you weren't listening. When people started hearing, check in on your Black friends, and they looked around and they didn't actually have any Black friends. And so they decided to send a text to a coworker who's like, why is this person texting me? We're not friends. Like, I didn't even know they knew I worked with them, right? And so I think all of those people who are having those experiences have to first, in order to get to a place where you design for dignity, you have to first reflect and atone and on what you've contributed to not doing that in the first place. And that is actually hard work. It is hard work to say, we want to start designing for dignity, and look around and see who we've decided to hire, who we've decided to promote. If all of our staff of color are on the administrative side, or if they're all entry level because we've made a push recently, but we haven't done anything to support and retain and promote and nurture. And so we can't stop. I was talking to a client the other day who said, well, while I'm trying to hire and recruit and retain and train and, do all these things for the staff I currently have, do I put the work on hold? And my answer was, you can't put the work on hold, because whether or not people want to do equity work, this pandemic and this inflection point around racial justice is requiring you to. If you are not looking at all of these intersectional issues, you are not relevant. You're just not relevant anymore. So you have to figure out in this moment how you're going to start looking at work differently and doing the work. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that other stuff, training your staff, doing your own internal race audit, looking at whatever statement your organization put out and actually seeing what you're doing to hold yourself accountable. What are the concrete changes you're going to make? What are the resources that you're going to allocate? And all of those things take time. And you know, the last thing I'll say is I think this is particularly hard for folks who haven't done this type of work before, because it seems daunting and it seems overwhelming and it seems very long. And I think for many folks of color, it's like, yup. like that's just what the work is. That's just the world.
Yeah.
And sometimes this focus on just getting to the solution, just getting to the outcomes is a form of white supremacy in and of itself. Because as a Black person, I've always had to be uncomfortable with not knowing if my hard work was going to result in good things or if I could still be killed. I've always had to live with knowing that in the picture behind George Floyd with a knee on his neck is a green bike lane. And so the work I do might not change my life outcomes, right? And I've always had to live with the uncertainty of having a Stanford law degree, of getting really good grades, of being able to code switch and talk in a way that makes people more comfortable. I can't change my gender non-binariness. I can't change, you know, the way I inflect my voice when I'm really excited, and I can't change my skin. And if that my Blackness, if inhabiting a Black body is going to scare people no matter what, then I've always had to deal with the uncertainty of my process maybe not having a direct relation to my outcome. I've always had to know that wealth will never be like worked hard for. It will only be inherited, right? And how stripping ownership from my people for years has always hindered me. But for white people, or for people who haven't had to face any type of oppression, they've bought into this belief that if you just do things the right way or work hard, you can just get to the outcome. And so they like to go to the outcomes. They like to go to the end. How can we design for equity? How can we design for dignity? And they don't like to get stuck in the uncertainty of the process of, well, we're going to have to change the way we do things. We're going to have to redistribute power and decision making, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. And that scares us in our profession because we like to know what we're aiming towards. And so you have to get comfortable with that discomfort. That's the first thing.
Yeah, that is words spoken so clearly and eloquently. Tamika, I appreciate that, and I hope everyone else does as well, because this is the kind of discussion that's going to open up that chasm of discomfort, one that we have to become comfortable with, because for this 401 years of condition to be dismantled, it's not going to happen today or a year from now. It's got to be a lifelong commitment, and becoming comfortable, being uncomfortable, which is part of what you were saying, is existential in its sort of rhetoric. But when one thinks about that, that's something that people not only have to become comfortable with, but become desirous of. In other words, through difficult exploration into these issues that are deeply personal for many white people and for Black folks as well, there comes a sort of crossroad, or a series of crossroads, where you have to ask yourself some very scary questions. Dr. Stephen Covey, in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, spoke of how we live our lives, climbing a ladder that's built on the relationships that we've enjoyed, the people we look up to, our parents or colleagues or peers. And we get up this ladder with a certain life view, worldview, and for reasons like a George Floyd incident, we're caused to look at the wall upon which the ladder is leaning and call it the wrong wall. But if you see it as the wrong wall, and there's a right wall somewhere over there, it takes tremendous courage and commitment to step down off that ladder and to reposition it and to start that ascension again. And that's where we are, where people are gonna, every individual is gonna be confronted with that choice. So in my conversations with particularly like the AIA large firm roundtable, 50, 60 of the largest firms in the country who've assembled in a group, we're trying to battle this thing. What is a firm but a collection of individuals? And if we don't start addressing empathy, understanding, compassion, and paradigm shift at the level of the individual, then we won't have a foundation firm enough to build this new future on. And so I do believe that it ultimately comes down to how individual people take responsibility at this time. And obviously, when there's pressure, one sort or another, that helps advance that kind of idea. But when the shock wave has passed, when the tsunami that rolled in and is completely receded, and we see the damage that's left in the landscape, are we going to build that back the same way it was, knowing that there'll be another tsunami coming? Or are we going to have innovative new ways of living that are going to allow for the world to do, for us to be stronger and survive on it? So I mean, it's just not my position to be panelizing here. I mean, the rest of you all to weigh in. I think we've just opened this thing up beyond transportation and mobility to kind of the pieces that are relevant, that are going to underpin any discussion about our systems. So I would invite any of my panelists here to pick up on what Tamika was talking about. And this is a place where thankfully we're able to share in a safe space our thoughts and our emotions. And I'm getting some of them through the chat window. I think this is really the heart of what many of us want to talk about.
I just wanted to thank Tamika for your honesty and clarity that bringing those thoughts to the conversation. I think to take it to all I wanted to add, everyone here who wakes up at 8 o'clock in the morning for a conversation about public transportation and mobility is obviously cares, and cares in particular about cities. And so I would really make the point, although it's slightly sacrilegious to me to maybe as an architect, but it's very important, I think, for urbanists or people who care about cities, to give it a less fancy name, to realize that this really is our work, because cities at the most fundamental level are people and not buildings. And cities are a process, not a thing, already and inherently. And so I think it's incumbent upon us as people who care about cities, not only to do this work, but to actually also make sure we're leaders in it.
Yes, I was just going to add, I think that's a really good point. And Stephen, your comment about the firm as a collection of individuals, I think was well put. I just want to add, I think it's when it's that collection of individuals also looking very hard at the work that they do and the projects that they take on. And I think this was a moment in the profession to really kind of step back and look at what's the work that we're doing. And I think it's like, what does it mean to go beyond? So beyond the potential, the paying work, to think about, how can a collection of creatives apply their collective brain power to solve pain points in society that have clearly been unattended for ages, and can there be betterment doing that? And then also I would add too, and Nicholas, I think it's great that you're representing academia, because I think that there's a bridge to academia, that there's this moment that the social inequities that we're talking about, the pandemic is also laying bare in the profession, which is that there needs to be a stronger bridge built into academia between the profession and those that are the next generation, such that those that are having an interest in this profession have an opportunity to, through their educational experiences, tackle real world problems in an academic setting in collaboration with professionals. Because I think that is also an amazing opportunity to, wherever in the world, from a next generation standpoint, to give them an opportunity and a platform to start to recognize the value of social impact and creativity applied to issues that are really affecting the world that the built environment needs to address.
Interesting that you, Jordan, went to we've got to collectively solve the problem, and back to Tamika's idea of our nature is to rush to the problem and to start, trying to attack it in a certain way. I think that as architects and designers, the next level of evolution is one of humility and putting the mechanisms for true listening into the process. I know we always say we listen to our clients and we design around their desires. However, there's a level that starts within the organization and how these discussions are had about problem solving approaches and how people other than, middle to older white males are set in the lineup of members of an organization or team that are looking at issues and problems. And rather than assuming the head of the table, the default lead, there may be, it's time to put other people with other points of view in those leading positions and see how that all works. So this is experimental in a lot of ways for mostly a lot of white people. For Black folks, we've had to try, this road, that avenue, that way in, and we've had to make our way. And that gets back to the seamless navigation between two universes, the code switching that allows me to speak to you all in this manner today, but to turn to my sisters, Kendra and Tamika, and say, yo, y'all, what up? I mean, come on, let's get with this program. So we want to share some of that joy with the rest of the world, our cultural nuance of how we really value communication and how we talk to one another. Someone in a call yesterday said, well, I have to turn that switch off when I go into the office. Well, why? Because there's nothing but, love and joy surrounding it. So why would you have to curtail that because it's different than the status quo? So this is cultural evolution time right now. And I'm sorry, somebody else wanted to jump in on something.
Yeah, this is Keandra. I was just gonna jump in on this conversation of how we solve the problem and what's that process like. I think a really important component of that is making sure that we're not, okay, let me step back. First, I do think we need to diversify who's at the table, but we also need to expand that table to include community voices. Community engagement is a significant part of this work. If we are to truly focus on equity, we need to be talking to the people that are most impacted and understanding how are they impacted, what are their needs, and then using that information to inform our work. So as a public agency, while we have a long way to go to get to that point where we're truly doing well at that, that's one of the things we're working on at Metro. And I hope, Metro is certainly a client for many architects of different sorts, but I'm hoping that by changing our processes internally and the way we think about community engagement and the way we engage with people, that puts some pressure on our end for those who we hire as consultants, et cetera, to help us with this, to help us do that work. And I would hope that, as architects and design professionals, that this group and others are more open and pushing for that as well, because that's how we make more effective, more inclusive design. If we truly want to have a more equitable landscape, built environment, et cetera, we have to include those voices, and we can't assume that even if we have, the most diverse, and I've seen this, I've seen diverse tables of people, at different agencies. I've worked in different public agencies, but still we're missing certain voices because there's a certain lived experience that's not included. And there's a certain important just perspective of the lived experience of folks that we're not getting if we don't go out into the community. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I totally agree with Keandra. I think we are at this place where it's been really powerful to see, as Jordan mentioned, like the bridge to academia. I think somebody said in the comments, the bridge to policymakers, but I think it also has to be a bridge to community voices. One of the things you hear constantly doing this work, at least on the planning side, maybe not as much on the architecture side, but I think we all hear it is like, well, what does the data say? What does the data say? And even in this conversation, we've talked a lot about data. And for me, something that's always been hard is that there are people who, because they haven't experienced something, they don't believe it's true. And they don't believe it's true until they see data. But academic institutions are racist, and they have historically kept people out. And you have to take tests to get in that have historically had higher fail rates or lower scores for people of color, right? And so when I say that racism and white supremacy could be overwhelming is because it's just piled on top of, you know, structure after structure after structure. And so it doesn't help me as a Black genderqueer person to say, great, the white people who run architecture firms are now going to talk to the white people in academia about how they're going to save my community, and they're never going to talk to us. And you know, I always share this example. There was a Department of Transportation that wanted to stop people from dying, a valiant effort. And so they went into a community and they looked at the data and they looked at where people were dying, and they decided that they were going to redesign the crosswalks and redesign the pedestrian walk signals and the timing of the traffic lights. And they did all of that work and they spent all of that money, and people kept dying. And only then did they talk to the community, who said to them, the bus stop is over there and there's no shade structure, because as we've heard many times, and there's a lot of data about shade structures in low-income communities of color versus non-low-income communities of color. But across the street from this bus stop with no shade structure, there is a tree. And so you can design the crosswalks in all the way you want, but people are still going to be under this tree. And they're not going to go up to the corner to cross your new crosswalk when they see the bus coming. They're going to try to run across the street because they need shade. And the solution was always there. The expertise was always there in the community. But those of us with fancy degrees have worked really hard for those fancy degrees. As Stephen said, we've worked really hard to climb that ladder and to get our seat at the table. And sometimes what we fail to realize is the table in that boardroom isn't where we should be. It might be the barbershop, it might be the stoop, it might be the corner, it might be under the tree. And it is really hard for us to shake ourselves of that thinking, because a lot of folks in power have not had some of those life experiences, like Keandra is saying. And so it's, you know, when I keep coming back to power, I think it's because people fail to realize the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is, yeah, you can have a lot of exotic faces sitting around your table. You can have the person in the wheelchair. You can have a trans folks. You can have a religious minority. Like, if you're really good, you might even have someone who is indigenous, right? And then you have those diverse faces and you say, well, we've done a good job, but it's only one or two, and they're not a partner, they're a principal. Or they're not an equity partner, they're a junior partner, right? And what are their decision-making powers? Maybe you let them run the diversity task force, but they don't actually have any real power in that position. And so diversity.
Let me jump in there real quick. I want Nicholas on the academic side to have a response. But there's an adage that we use that Maurice Cox introduced when we all gathered to be planners in Detroit. And worked to restore trust in a community, 83% Black city, where trust for 4 decades had been dismantled and destroyed. And the adage is, nothing about us without us is for us. That's pretty powerful and pretty simple. And that's one that we recited at every community meeting. And that's another chapter and another story, but it is possible through the employing the methods and the sensibilities that Tamika is speaking about, to reach new levels of channels of communication, productive channels that open between communities and institutions like firms and public agencies. But Nicholas.
Oh, no, I don't want to cut off the conversation. I think, but on the question of academia, I can say, you know, certainly the paradigms in my previous life at Berkeley, the paradigms of co-design and community engagement were an essential part of how we thought about design there. When I explained it to my colleagues at MIT, you know, many but not enough of whom are doing this kind of work already, I explained it in terms of it's not just who we invite in our door, it's how we go out our door. I think historically, particularly my own you know, bugbear is all the traveling studios that tend to happen at wealthy architecture schools like the one I'm now at, that go all over the world to solve a lot of problems, but don't necessarily look at the cities where we are. And so we're, you know, taking the opportunity already this fall to do a lot of community design work in our studios, but at MIT. But the issue, is not design, but co-design, not creation, but co-creation, and the sort of solutionism of academia and its tendency to focus on numbers, I think, is a particular hazard of digitization of data, of expertise, of references. And so the other line I always give people is I think it was actually Einstein's, but everything that counts cannot be counted, and everything that can be counted doesn't necessarily count. And so even when you're in data-driven fields like planning, it's still a very important thing to remember.
Great, great. Will, it looks like we have about 9 minutes left. I just want to drag you back into the conversation. Are there any kind of housekeeping things that you want to talk about, or anything having to do with the?
We'll try to get that out so it doesn't ever happen again. But I really want to thank everybody. We could go a few more minutes because I recognize we got a little bit of a delayed start. But we have a question here from Bryn, and it had to do with hostile design. So if Bryn is on the line, we would love to include your question.
Sure, you want me to say it?
Sure.
Yeah, well, I've just encountered too many times in recent years where there's sort of been an embrace of hostile design as wanting to keep houseless people out of public plaza areas, right? That it's not for those people to be enjoying a comfortable shaded plaza environment or seating that they would want to sit on for a long time. And so I just, I wonder if this time of COVID and us sort of realizing we need more outdoor public spaces for people to be able to socialize in, if it could be the end of us creating those public spaces that aren't so welcoming.
So I could try. I'm not an architect or a designer, but I can chime in just kind of from the perspective of having these very conversations right now. I think it won't change unless we're intentional about it. I think the default, especially when it comes to talking about the unhoused population, whether it's in planning, like land use planning or transportation planning, et cetera, the default, I think for many who kind of see unhoused folks as more, less as people and more as a thing, something to address with people's customer experience, their default is to think about how to police their presence. And we have to push ourselves beyond that to recognize these are people. They have a right to the public space just as anybody else, but we want to focus on behaviors that are problematic within the system. So we don't want people to have to live in our system. So what can we do as a transportation agency to help reduce that? What can we do to support, transitional housing or this higher service provision to help people get what they need? What can we do to make that shift? And I think we just really have to be intentional. And it's hard because we get surveys constantly from people, and we ask about, how can we improve your customer experience? And we do hear people have complaints about the unhoused population, but we have to dig deeper into how do we actually address what is at issue? Is it people urinating in the elevators? Because that is a real issue. Is it people, we have to focus on the behaviors, and we have to be just more intentional about thinking about how can we actually help to solve the reason behind the problematic behaviors and not focus on just moving homeless people. I think it's a challenge, but we have to do it. And I mean, across all government agencies, I don't think this is a unique problem to transportation agencies or within the mobility context, but I think we have to have these conversations and don't just leave it at the surface about what do we do with the homeless population, but instead, how do we address the issues that they're facing so that we can help them to be able to live somewhere or get the services they need to be able to be a productive member of society, et cetera, and focus on reducing those actions as opposed to removing people. So we have to work at it.
Kendra, that's another layer of how it ties into the discussions about policing and whether you want to say defunding or reprioritizing funds to better address issues like mental health and things that don't necessarily demand a armed response. And so many of these situations that we've now borne witness to escalated from something that should have been handled by a different kind of professional than an armed police officer. Metro light rail rider, and I do know Phil Washington, the CEO of Metro, enough that when I'm on the train and some bad stuff, it's somebody laying across 3 seats when everyone else is standing up, or someone that unfortunately is mentally ill and may have not bathed in days. And so during the height of rush hour, one of the train cars is only half full. I have been known to take photographs with my iPhone and text them to Phil, and I always get a response back. But how is, what is Metro's policy? Because I do know that there are a lot of officers, and there are different kinds of officers that I see on the trains, and some have the more aggressive posture, and others are more in the sort of mindset of helping a social issue out.
So can you, okay, your question is, what is the policy around?
No, well, can you sort of describe Metro's policing approach, and whether there are different types of, law enforcement professionals working within the system? And are they all from Metro, or some of them LAPD? How does that all break down?
So our policing, so we have our system safety and security and law enforcement division, and they have a contract with 3 different law enforcement agencies: LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, Long Beach Police Department, and then LA Sheriffs. And so and then we also have Metro transit security. So there are different levels. Some who are armed and are mainly supposed to respond to like violent incidents, etc. Then we have the Metro Transit Police, who are, or I guess transit security, who are unarmed, who are mostly there to check for fares, etc. So there's kind of a range as far as the different position types across the different departments and agencies and the partnerships with them. And then they also, each of those different departments, they focus on different jurisdictions within the region. So Long Beach, of course, is mostly looking at, the Blue Line and bus stops in that area. LAPD is LA, and then the sheriffs are kind of everywhere else. But I will say, our board did pass a motion last month to re-look at our system, our safety and security system, look at, create a committee and have these questions about what does it mean to feel safe and to be safe on the system for our different customers, and what can we do to reimagine what that looks like. Our contract with those 3 law enforcement departments ends in 2022, so in 2 years. So that is a prime opportunity to figure out, do we need to adjust that, reduce that, create other alternatives, better support some of our partners like PATH, who we work with. It's people assisting the homeless. We work with them to connect folks that are unhoused on our system to social services, to housing, etc. Can we increase that? Do we need more partnerships to try and address the behaviors on our system that aren't criminal, but that to help people, essentially? Can we rethink what that looks like? And so we have a committee we're creating a committee that's going to be working on that, and I will be a part of that work as well. So look forward to seeing how we reimagine safety and security on our system.
Okay, I mute myself there. We're down to the 9:30 moment. As Will said, we can hang a little longer if folks have burning questions that they haven't seen answered yet. And Will, there you are.
I think Nicholas has to step off, so I don't know if you have final remarks before.
Oh, I just wanted to thank you for having me, and for it was a real pleasure to be part of this discussion, and I look forward to hopefully seeing many of you again and work together on cities.
Thank you. And Jordan has a hard stop as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that sentiment. Thank you. Great conversation, and a timely one, and a very necessary one that is relevant to what's going on now. So look forward to continuing the dialogue, and thanks for having me from the other coast, from DC.
Excellent. Well, thank you
Jordan.
for joining.
I have to jump as well, folks. Thanks, like Jordan and Nicholas said, thanks for having me. I think, just remember, inclusion is not just
Yeah, so do I.
everybody feeling like they have a place, but it's changing decision making power and who gets to decide and set culture. So thanks for having us, Will. This was great.
Check your chat window before you get off. I think we're done because many of us we're on borrowed time. So it's been a really great panel. Thank you all. Yeah, we could go on all day, which has pretty much been how my days have been. All day thinking about these issues and trying to keep the fire burning.
Well, thank you, everyone. Our next conversation will be on parks and open space on Thursday, July 30th, and I'll share an invite with everyone. And I do apologize for our technical glitches, and I really want to say thank you to everyone that participated. And Neil, Tamika, Stephen, Keandra, Jordan, and Nicholas, thank you for taking time out of your day, and AIA Los Angeles sincerely thanks you, and we will keep in touch.